So the Italian foreign minister, as we were saying moments ago, has put the death toll at about 1,000, only after 8 days of violence with no end in sight. With Gaddafi waging war on his own people, is he fighting his last battle here, do you think?
I think he probably is, but it's a very different situation from most of the other protest movements in the Middle East, in my opinion, because Gaddafi, of course, has been in power for 42 years, and he sees himself as a revolutionary against the West, certainly against the sort of military-industrial complex. So his mindset is perhaps slightly different, and because he's been considered a rogue nation for so long, he feels like he has less accountability, perhaps, towards his Western allies now. So I think he probably will fight on, and he is used to using violence. He has reigned very brutally for the last 42 years, and I don't think he'll give up without a fight. So I'd be very surprised if the death toll remains at 1,000.
Now, regardless of Gaddafi and his own orchestrated attacks on the protesters, there's been violence between the pro- and anti-government demonstrators, neighbour versus neighbour, people dying in the streets, blood on the streets. Tell me, why are the Libyans paying such a high price to have their voices heard?
Well, I think partly because of the repression of the regime over the last 4 decades. They have been brutalised, and they have less communication, perhaps, with the outside world. They're not quite as teched up, perhaps, as some of the other Middle Eastern countries. So even the younger generation are perhaps finding it harder to coordinate what's going on. But it's just the very brutality of the regime that's been in place, and the fact that the West has been cozying up to Gaddafi ever since 2003, when he came in from the cold and became our new ally in the war against terror, means that he's, of course, very tooled up with lots of new weapons, which have been supplied by countries like France and the Netherlands and the UK. So he's in a very strong position, and also a very strong position financially, to fight back. And I think perhaps that some of his new ally friends in the West are a little confused on how to respond to what to do about him.
Now, when you talk about the West and how the West has been cozying up to Gaddafi for the better part of 10 years now, it seems that dictatorships in the Middle East only seem to survive as long as the West is satisfied with them. Saddam was once useful, now he's dead. Mubarak, he was known as a close ally. He's no longer in power. Do you think the West is trying to reshape the political map in the region, or is it just powerless in this ongoing revolt?
I think it is becoming increasingly powerless. It's realising that perhaps its days of post-colonial hegemony are gone. And there is a new generation of activists, of protesters who's coming through, who can make a difference, who can coordinate these sort of activities. But with Gaddafi, I think the situation is slightly different, because he had come in from the cold. He was the sort of poster boy of being a post-rogue dictatorship. Of course, after he'd seen what happened to Saddam Hussein, he did offer up what little technology he had, which might have been taking him towards a situation where he had weapons of mass destruction. And then, of course, he was welcomed back into the international fold with open arms, and has been allowed to start opening up his country to a certain extent, but certainly financially. So he's in a very different position, and I think because of that, because he's been held up as the way to go, the way that the West can deal with Middle Eastern dictators and bring them back into the fold, they really just don't know how to handle this. They're sort of backing off, but they don't want to overtly support the protesters either.
So you're saying that the West is growingly powerless in what's becoming a regional revolt here, but you're a former intelligence officer. Did you recognise similar roots in this conflict to other previous uprisings, and what is the role of intelligence agencies from the West when it comes to what we're seeing in the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, indeed, the intelligence agencies have a long history of dirty tricks and subverting and promoting whatever protest movements suit their political agenda at the time. But I do think it's a sort of generational shift in some of the other countries that have already experienced their revolution, in Egypt and Tunisia. But I think certainly Libya has a long and bloody history with the Western intelligence agencies. I mean, there was a sort of escalation of terror from the 1980s onwards, where Gaddafi was funding organisations like the Abu Nidal organisation and the IRA and Palestinian groups. And in retaliation, the West did bomb Tripoli in 1986. And of course, then he retaliated by bombing things like the French flight UT-772 and Pan Am 103. So there was a sort of escalation of terror, which really reached its zenith in the 1990s when MI6, the British intelligence agency, funded an Islamic extremist group in Libya to try and topple Gaddafi. So I think at this stage, the West also, as well as being involved intelligence-wise, has given safe haven to a lot of his most outspoken oppositionists, certainly in the UK. So I would not be surprised if there is a sort of tacit, under-the-table encouragement of those oppositionists within Libya at the moment, but the West just can't show its hands.
Now, I am running very low on time here, but briefly, for weeks, European leaders have cried that multiculturalism has failed. Such an immigrant tsunami, wouldn't that further strain the already crippled regional economies if indeed the immigrants do move across?
Well, if indeed that happens, but I think this is a bit of sabre rattling between Italy and Libya, which has history on this front. And of course, Libya did threaten to send over a mass migration a few years ago, and Italy retaliated by saying, no, it's okay, we will give you reparation for our colonialism. But I have to say, I think that if these countries do open up, if a real meaningful sense of democracy is achieved by the protesters, then the young, the educated, the technologically savvy who are the sort of vanguard of these protests will actually be in a position where they can build their countries, and they'll be happy to stay there in their countries building a future.
Fascinating insight. Annie Machon, former MI5 agent, live from Dusseldorf. Thank you.